After seeing my first video, you've already learned about the basics of the reward pathway from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens and the role of dopamine in it. If you haven't seen it, here's the link. Unfortunately, things are a bit more complicated, and in order to understand my other videos about how the reward system is altered with different mental conditions, we need to have a closer look at tonic and phasic dopamine release. The typical activation of the pathway is a consequence of a reward prediction or an unexpected reward that results in an activation of neurons in the nucleus accumbens is called the phasic dopamine release. So the phasic release is a high-frequency release of dopamine into the synapse between the dopamine neuron and the neuron of the nucleus accumbens. However, the dopamine neurons also constantly release some dopamine in a slow, irregular rhythm, mostly around the synapse, the tonic release, where it kind of swims around between the neurons and therefore is called the extracellular dopamine. Their concentration is not high enough to stimulate dopamine receptors of the neurons of the nucleus accumbens, but they do bind to some autoreceptors of the dopamine neurons from the VTA, the neurons where they're coming from. This binding to the autoreceptors inhibits the phasic release of the same neuron. However, not all neurons have a tonic and phasic dopamine release, but only those that are active at that moment. Another brain region, the ventral pallidum, always inactivates some of the neurons in the VTA. The percentage of the neurons that are still active and therefore involved in phasic and tonic dopamine release is called the population activity. What is the purpose of the regulation of the population activity by the ventral pallidum? We have learned that neurons from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens get activated with reward prediction and unexpected rewards. However, this is not always the case, because a subpopulation of neurons of the same pathway have a different function. They activate when we realize a new stimulus that might be important, not knowing yet whether it indicates a possible reward or threat. The degree to which a stimulus is noticed by us is called salience, and in some situations it is more important to pay attention to possible stimuli than in others. You might recognize the following example. Let's say we're walking in a dark forest, it is spooky, and we're therefore a bit anxious and stressed. We will pay attention to every single noise around us, even those that we would normally not notice. And that makes sense, because in a potentially dangerous situation, that can be a sign of a threat. Or let's say our ancestors are hunting. In that moment, it is important for them to pay attention to all kinds of small movements around them in order to track down the animals. So this is the idea behind the population activity controlled by the ventral pallidum. When we're in a stressed or anxious situation, it will inhibit less of those neurons standing for salience, and therefore more neurons will be active. We pay more attention to clues around us compared to when we are just lying on the couch. So typically we have high tonic and potentially high phasic dopamine release when we have a high population activity, for example in stressful situations, and low tonic and reduced phasic dopamine release when we have a low population activity, for example when lying on the couch. However, there can be other reasons of changes in the tonic dopamine release. In my previous videos, I talked about reward prediction error, which means that the dopamine release rises if a reward is bigger than expected but falls when it is smaller than expected or not even there at all. And this decrease of dopamine after the omission of a reward is actually a decrease of the tonic release, resulting in a lower concentration of extracellular dopamine. There are now some pathways from the prefrontal cortex, another brain region, to the nucleus accumbens that stand for switching strategy. That means trying new things. And the neurons of this pathway have a lot of autoreceptors. So a reduction in tonic release and consequently a reduction in extracellular dopamine leads to an overactivation of that pathway, as less dopamine is binding to autoreceptors. And that makes sense, because we should probably try new things if we experience that one action no longer results in a reward. Now check out my other videos in my playlist about the reward system to find out how the reward system is altered with stress and mental disorders like depression, mania, ADHD, autism, schizophrenia and drug addiction, and how that explains a lot of the symptoms people with these disorders experience. And as I'm constantly working on new videos about this and other topics of the brain, don't forget to subscribe to my channel.